Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Emma Waldron, WCVA's Risk, Procurement and Governance Manager, and I'm also WCVA's Data Protection Officer. Privacy by Design is the 8th webinar of the Desktop Data series, and this will be the final session for 2017. We will be continuing to hold regular monthly sessions next year, up until May 2018, when the new GDPR requirements comes into place. Our speaker is Bethan Bonsall from the ICO. Welcome, Bethan.
Hi.
Bethan is the ICO's Policy Officer, and she is here today to discuss privacy by design. We anticipate today's session to take approximately 30 minutes maximum, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions afterwards. Please also feel free to add any questions to the chat pane during the session, and we'll aim to answer them at the end of the presentation. There will also be an opportunity to share your comments by completing a short survey, which we will share details of on the final slide. Okay, over to you, Bethan.
Thanks, Emma, and hello to everyone that's dialed in today. As Emma said, I'm Bethan, and I'm the Lead Policy Officer for the ICO in Wales, and I'm here today to talk about the concept of privacy by design. We'll be looking at what the term actually means, the areas where adopting a privacy by design approach will be essential for charities listening today, and how to go about building privacy by design into your core processes when handling personal data. For those of you who don't know, the Information Commissioner's Office regulates, amongst other laws, the current Data Protection Act, which governs how you should handle personal data. The Data Protection Act has been enforced for 19 years, but many of you watching today will be aware that on the 25th of May next year, the Act will be replaced by the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR for short. It's the biggest change to data protection laws in our lifetimes, and whilst privacy by design is important under the current Data Protection Act, it becomes more of an explicit requirement under the GDPR, which is why it's so good that you're joining us this afternoon. So let's start by asking ourselves, what exactly is privacy by design? Put simply, privacy by design is an approach to projects that promotes privacy and data protection compliance from the start. Unfortunately, these issues are often bolted on as an afterthought or ignored altogether. Privacy by design has always been an implicit requirement of data protection that the ICO has consistently championed, but under the GDPR you have a general obligation to implement technical and organisational measures to show that you've considered and integrated data protection into your processing activities. GDPR refers to this approach as data protection by design and default. So when do you need to think about privacy by design? The ICO encourages organisations to ensure that privacy and data protection is a key consideration in the early stages of any project, and then throughout its life cycle. So what type of projects or initiatives might benefit from a privacy by design approach? The first is designing new IT systems. So when building new IT systems for storing or accessing personal data, thinking about data protection up front allows organisations to build systems that allow individuals to exercise their rights, and also helps organisations comply with the principles of the GDPR. Imagine your charity spends 2 months designing a new casework management system. You invest not only time and money, but weeks of staff resources. But just as you're about to roll out the new system across your charity, the person with data protection responsibility pops their head up to advise that the system doesn't actually allow inaccurate personal data to be amended, nor does it allow any data from the system to be deleted when necessary. Had the key individuals been involved from the start, the money and time invested wouldn't have been wasted, as a privacy by design approach would have addressed these issues at the outset. Charities developing policy or strategies that have privacy implications will also benefit from adopting a privacy by design approach. An example would be if your charity is drafting an IT policy or any other policy that's got a potential privacy risk. This is an area where you may wish to think about privacy by design, especially if you feel that the nature of the policy or the strategy or initiative indicates that you need to think about data protection at the outset rather than having it as an expensive afterthought. If your charity is embarking on a new data sharing initiative, then building data protection considerations at the outset will help you to ensure that only the relevant information is shared. You'll ensure that it's shared securely and that individuals are informed as to the purpose of the sharing. And also using data for new purposes is an area where privacy by design is important. So if your charity has personal data which you collected for one purpose, but wish to use it for another, then privacy by design will help you to determine whether the new purpose will be able to be achieved while still complying with the GDPR principles. So what are the benefits of a privacy by design approach? We've already mentioned some of them, but let's revisit some of these quickly. So firstly, potential problems are identified at an early stage when addressing them will often be simpler and less costly to your charity. Increased awareness of privacy and data protection across an organisation or your charity is another benefit of privacy by design. Organisations are more likely to meet your legal obligations and less likely to breach the Data Protection Act as it stands, or after May, the General Data Protection Regulation. And finally, actions are less likely to be privacy intrusive and therefore less likely to have a negative impact on individuals that you're processing data about. An integral part of taking a privacy by design approach is by conducting a data protection impact assessment or a privacy impact assessment. So the two terms mean the exact same thing, but data protection impact assessment is a more recent term because that's what GDPR refers it to as. So from now on, we'll cover what a DPIA involves, but I'll be calling privacy impact assessments or data protection impact assessments, I'll be calling them DPIAs for the purposes of this webinar. So it's always nice to have a bit of interaction from those listening today. So just to get a feel for how many of you have undertaken a DPIA, so a data protection impact assessment, it'd be nice to stop for a moment and take a quick poll. So rather than using the voting options, if you're happy to type in the comments box, if you've undertaken a DPIA in the past, then please feel free to type yes into the comments box. If you haven't, then please feel free to type no, but just remember, it's not a vote to try and catch people out. It's simply for me and Emma to gain an insight into how much DPIAs are being used in the third sector at present. So just having a little look at the results. So quite a few no's, which is absolutely fine.
Yeah, so the majority knows, but some have assessed or some are working through it, and one yes.
Bro, and hopefully the person that answered yes found them a really valuable tool. So if you have carried out a DPIA, then that's absolutely great. But if you haven't, then we're going to look in the rest of this webinar as to what they involve in more detail. So hopefully by the end of the webinar, you'll see how valuable they'll be for your charity in terms of new projects and initiatives. So first of all, it's useful to note that the ICO has got a really good privacy impact assessment code of practice that you can see on your screen. And again, it's back to the point where we used to refer to them as PIAs, but that code of practice will be really useful when you're referring to DPIAs as well. And that'll be a key document for your charity to use when looking at how exactly to go about conducting a DPIA. And I mentioned during my first slide that although privacy by design is an implicit requirement of the current Data Protection Act, the term becomes more explicit when we look towards the GDPR. So for example, whilst DPIAs are a useful tool of demonstrating privacy by design, they'll actually be mandatory under GDPR in two circumstances. So the first is if you're using new technologies, and the second area where you'll have to carry out a DPIA is where your charity is embarking on processing of personal data that's likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. Now, our GDPR guidance expands on what exactly is likely to constitute processing that's likely to result in a high risk to individuals. But some examples, just for this webinar's sake, include large-scale processing of quite sensitive data. So that could be health information, etc. Or it could be systematic processing that's likely to have a significant effect on individuals involved. Our code of practice breaks down the process into a series of simpler steps. So I thought it'd be useful for us to have a look at these briefly and see what each step entails and why they're so important. So the first step is to identify the need for a DPIA. The need for a PIA or a DPIA can be identified as part of an organisation's normal project management process, but the ICO's code of practice helpfully includes some screening questions that your charity can ask yourself at the start of a project, and it's those questions that will lead you on to determining whether you do or don't need to carry out a DPIA. So the questions are found in Annex 1 of the code, and you'll see that they're questions that can be answered by someone who isn't necessarily a data protection expert. therefore can be answered by project managers or other individuals who don't specialise in privacy matters. So we'll give you a couple of moments to look at the type of questions on the screen, and then I'll hand you over to Emma, who'll go through some of them with you.
Okay, so we thought this slide was quite important, so I'm just going to read through some of the questions that are asked here. So the first one is, will the project involve the collection of new information about individuals? Will the project compel individuals to provide information about themselves? Will information about individuals be disclosed to organisations or people who have not previously had routine access to the information? Are you currently using information about individuals for a purpose it is not currently used for, or in a way it is not currently used? Does the project involve you using new technology which might be perceived as being privacy intrusive, for example, the use of biometrics or facial recognition? Will the project result in you making decisions or taking action against individuals in ways which can have a significant impact on them? Is the information about individuals of a kind particularly likely to raise privacy concerns or expectations? For example, health records, criminal records, or other information that people would consider to be particularly private? And then finally, will the project require you to contact individuals in ways which they might find intrusive?
Thanks for that, Emma. Hopefully that's been useful to see the types of questions that you need to be asking when determining whether you need to carry out a DPIA. So if your charity has answered the questions on the previous slide and other questions that you've also decided to ask, and you've identified the need for a DPIA, then the next step will be to map out what happens to the personal information in your new project or initiative. This includes describing how information is collected, stored, used, and subsequently deleted. They should explain what information is used, what it's used for, and who will have access to it. This step is a key part of any DPIA process. A thorough assessment of privacy risks is only possible if your charity fully understands how information is being used in any given project. An incomplete understanding of how information is used can be a significant privacy risk. For example, you might not be aware of the fact that data might be disclosed inappropriately or used for unfair purposes. The next step is all about assessing the likely privacy issues associated with the project. A key principle of the DPIA process and of privacy by design in general is that the process is a form of risk management. When conducting a DPIA, a charity is systematically considering how the project will affect individuals. Risks to individuals include risks such as new technology or surveillance methods that pose a high level of intrusion. Another risk would be the unnecessary collection or duplication of data, which might lead to a higher security risk. These are only a couple of examples of what a risk to a group of individuals might look like, and helpfully the code expands on these and many others. Remember that privacy risks to individuals, such as a project seen as highly intrusive or insecure, can often have compliance and reputational risks to your charity. This again highlights the importance of getting data protection right by building in privacy considerations from the outset. Step 4 is to identify any privacy solutions. So this next stage requires your charity to identify what action can be taken to address the risks to privacy that you may have identified as part of stage 3. It's important to remember that the aim of a DPIA isn't to completely eliminate the impact on privacy, but to reduce the impact to an acceptable level while still allowing a useful project to be implemented. When deciding on privacy solutions, your charity will need to consider whether the impact on privacy is proportionate to the aims of the project. Privacy solutions are steps which can be taken to reduce the privacy impact. So the aim of this stage, so stage 4, is to balance the project's outcomes and the aims with the impact that that's going to have on individuals. And this stage should really allow your charity to work out whether the privacy solutions have led to the privacy risks being completely eliminated, reduced, or simply just accepted by your charity. The next step, sign off and record outcomes. Keeping a record of the process will ensure that the necessary measures are implemented. It can also be used to assure the public, the ICO, and other stakeholders that the project has been thoroughly assessed for privacy risks. A DPIA doesn't necessarily require a formal signing off process, but this will depend on the nature of the project. If a charity is working on a large-scale project with a higher level of risk, then it would be good practice to ensure that the DPIA has been signed off or approved at senior level. For smaller projects, it might be appropriate for the project leader to accept the privacy risks rather than having that higher level of sign-off. And the final step is to feed the results of the DPIA back into the wider project management process, so integrating the outcomes into the project plan. Most of the work required by a DPIA will take place during the planning and early implementation of a project, but your charity should also take care to ensure that the steps taken as a result of the DPIA have been properly implemented and are having the desired effect. So DPIAs are an evolving process, rather than just something that's been carried out at the beginning and disregarded or forgotten about thereafter. For example, if a project's aims change through the life cycle, the screening questions may need to be revisited to ensure that the DPIA is still appropriate. Note that there's an additional step which may be to consult with internal and external stakeholders throughout the process. This step might ensure that your charity has a clearer grasp of the privacy issues that the project might come across. So having looked at the steps involved in the DPIA, it's clear to see how much your charity will gain from conducting one. People's information is an asset, and an important one at that. So by embedding privacy into your day-to-day processes and procedures, you'll go a long way in terms of making the people connected to your charity, whether it be donors, staff, or service users, happy. DPIAs and the wider privacy by design approach will also help you to demonstrate your accountability under GDPR when it comes into force next May. It won't simply be enough to just comply with the GDPR and its principles that you can see on the screen. Every organisation handling personal data will have to demonstrate how they're complying with the 6 principles. And this is known as the principle of accountability, which you can see on the screen there. And finally, whilst I hope this has been a useful webinar on the concept of privacy by design, I'm now going to hand over to Emma to see if there are any questions for me. So thank you for listening, everyone, and we'll see if there's any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Bethan. So now's the opportunity, if you do have any questions, obviously we're very privileged to have a representative from the ICO here with us today. So if you have any questions for Bethan, please feel free to type them into the chat pane. Just a few points that I want to reiterate here is, for example, Bethan was talking in her last but one slide about accountability. So just to reiterate that DPIA, the privacy impact assessment, will really, really help in terms of meeting the accountability requirement of GDPR. And I wanted to also make the point that this approach can also apply to contracts and grants as well, so something for you to consider there. And the final point that I wanted to make is that you can do a search online for privacy impact assessments, because a lot of public authorities, if they complete privacy impact assessments, will publish them and make them available. So it might be worth you having a look at that if you're not familiar with how they work at the moment. Okay, so in terms of questions then, so first question from Karen. How does the GDPR affect the storage and use of existing data?
Thanks for that question. It's a really useful one. So the best way to think about this is the fact that GDPR isn't a completely new obligation. It's basically an extension of your current obligations under the Data Protection Act. So if we break down your question, so how does GDPR affect the storage of data? In terms of storage, there's a similar principle under the GDPR as there is under the DPA. And that's basically about having the appropriate security. So when you're storing data, you've got to make sure that you're storing it in a way that's a kind of proportionate and appropriate to the type of data that you're storing. So very sensitive data wouldn't be kept in a really flimsy kind of cabinet. It would need to be under stricter security controls, whether that's technical or paper-based information. And then the use of data, the use has still got to be lawful. So the basis that we see under GDPR in terms of the legal kind of grounds that you need to collect and use data are very similar under both the Data Protection Act and the GDPR. So again, you still need to have a very warranted reason to collect and use personal data. You can't just collect data because you think it might be useful. You've got to strip it back to the most basic and think, what will my lawful basis under the GDPR be? And there's really good guidance on our website in respect to what those bases are and the types of considerations that you need to think about when deciding what your basis is. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, thanks, Bethan. Yeah, hopefully that helps you, Karen. And we have a few more questions coming in as well. And as the training team confirm, the slides will be made available and circulated following this session. So a question there from Emma. We are running a project helping very vulnerable people, fewer than 100 at present, and are about to start a lift share project. I would assume both need impact assessments to be safe and to show good practice.
That's certainly two areas where a PIA or a DPIA, sorry, would be extremely useful for your charity, not just because they're kind of setting out what privacy risks might be involved in those projects, but also to get you familiar with how exactly to conduct a privacy impact assessment ahead of the GDPR coming in. Because remember when I said back to the point about GDPR, they will actually be mandatory in two scenarios. So you've got your new technology, or if it's kind of high risk processing. So again, those would be two really good areas to conduct a PIA. And I think you'll find our DPIA code of practice really useful to start you getting familiar with the process.
Brilliant. Thanks, Bethan. I hope that helped, Emma. So question from Leander. Will the ICO website have a FAQ section and/or help desk telephone line?
Yep, so I'll just go on to the next slide now in terms of my contact details. I'm from the Wales office. We're a very small office, but we are here to help stakeholders in Wales. So any GDPR queries, please feel free to phone that number on the screen there. We've got a lot of useful guidance on our website. So if you've not been to ico.org.uk, there's a section about GDPR. And then we've still got an awful lot of guidance about the current Data Protection Act, because that's the law that's still in force and will be enforced until May next year. So please do keep kind of dipping in and out of that website, because that's where all our guidance is going.
Okay, thanks, Bethan. And there's also the chat pane as well, which I find very helpful. Myself, if I've got the odd question, I just type it into the ICO's chat pane, which is very useful for an instant response, really. And there's a question there from Denise. Will these impact on CCTV equipment?
So again, the use of CCTV, if it's capturing personal data, which it more than likely is, or it's 100% likely to, then yes, the GDPR will apply. And it could be that if you're rolling out new CCTV, then you might want to conduct a privacy impact assessment in relation to that new CCTV. But again, the GDPR principles that we saw a few slides ago are very similar to the current data protection principles. So yeah, the GDPR very much applies to CCTV.
Okay, thanks, Beth. I hope that helped, Denise. So now Debbie's question. Are there specific standards for online capture and storage of data, example through website/online apps, which we could write into the specification for IT development?
So we haven't got kind of stock templates, because the GDPR and the current Data Protection Act apply to every single different organisation in the UK, big or small, whatever their sector is, the same law applies to each sector. So we can't be as prescriptive in terms of having stock phrases or standards, but what you might find useful is our privacy notices, transparency and control document, which sets out different kind of phrases and different ideas in terms of when you're capturing data online, how to get across to that individual what's happening to their data. It links really strongly back to what we call the right to be informed, which is a new explicit right under GDPR. And it's all about your charity being as open and transparent as you can be in respect of collecting and using people's data. So certainly if you haven't had a look at that, our privacy notices, transparency and control document has got useful phrases and terminology in terms of getting that information across.
Okay, thanks, Bethan. Hope that helped, Debbie. Question there from Leander. As an engagement officer, I have both personal and professional email address in relation to collating views on consultations, NHS services, etc. And I believe the comment was added then, how should I evidence the use of this information?
So you've got to be sure what your legal basis under GDPR will be. So you might have someone's contact details for one purpose and then someone else is in a different capacity for another purpose. So it's all about making sure that what you're holding is being held lawfully. And again, you might be better off having a look at our GDPR guidance to see what those bases would be. I imagine if you've got a lot of information in terms of collating views on consultations, etc., then you might already have a legal basis set out under the current law. Always be careful in terms of things like marketing. So if you then go on to use someone's email address for a different purpose to try and promote the aims or ideals of your charity, then that borders over into direct marketing. And as part of that, you need to consider an additional law that the ICO regulates, which is called the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulations. But I imagine for most of it, in terms of your role as an engagement officer, you probably have a good legal basis under the current law, but it's just a case of mapping that out and making sure that you've got your appropriate legal basis under the GDPR as of next May.
Thank you, Bethan. And thanks for the question, Leander. Just to also add a comment there that we did run a direct marketing webinar as well, so that's available on the WCVA website if anybody wants to look at that. So I think this is a comment from Denise. Answer enables us to prepare for a possible new project regarding CCTV equipment. We'll now incorporate privacy by design into this. Great news.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Denise. Lovely. Okay, and I think that's all the questions. So we hope that you found this session useful. To help us to improve future webinars, please can you complete a short survey for us using the link provided on the slides you can see on your screen. The link will also be circulated to everyone who has attended today. Our next session is on data sharing, which will be held at 2 p.m. on Monday the 23rd of January. And in the meantime, if there are any topics that you'd like us to cover, please do get in touch. We very much look forward to you joining us again next month, and Merry Christmas from us here.
Merry Christmas. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.